In the annals of history, few names evoke such immediate revulsion and horror as Josef Mengele. Born in 1911, Mengele was a German physician who, seduced by the Nazi ideology of racial purity, would become the embodiment of evil during his time at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Arriving at the notorious death camp in 1943, Mengele quickly gained notoriety, his name whispered in hushed tones, a harbinger of suffering and despair. He was the Angel of Death, a man who held the power of life and death over hundreds of thousands of innocent souls. Mengele's background was deceptively ordinary. He studied anthropology and medicine, excelling in his academic pursuits. However, his intellect became twisted, his medical expertise a tool for inflicting unimaginable pain and suffering. He embraced the Nazi ideology with fervor, believing in the perverse notion of Aryan supremacy and the need to eliminate those deemed racially inferior. Driven by this toxic ideology, Mengele saw Auschwitz as a living laboratory, a place where he could conduct his horrific experiments on human beings with impunity. He was particularly fascinated by twins, believing that they held the key to unlocking the secrets of heredity and, by extension, the means to increase the birth rate of the Aryan race. His obsession with twins, coupled with his utter disregard for human life, would lead to some of the most horrific crimes committed within the already horrific confines of Auschwitz. The arrival of transports at Auschwitz was always a chaotic and terrifying affair. Families torn from their homes and herded like cattle were met with the deafening shouts of SS guards and the barking of trained dogs. It was here, amidst the pushing and shoving, the fear and uncertainty, that Mengele would make his selections. With a flick of his wrist, a casual point of his cane, he would decide the fate of thousands. The elderly, the infirm, young children and pregnant women were almost always sent to their deaths in the gas chambers. Able-bodied men and women were deemed fit for slave labor, at least for a time, but for those who caught Mengele's eye, twins, dwarfs, anyone with a physical anomaly, a different fate awaited. Mengele would often greet the newly arrived prisoners with a disarming smile, asking after their well-being. He was particularly interested in twins, promising them better food and living conditions if they volunteered for his medical research. For many, especially children, the promise of a kind word and a friendly face was enough to overcome their fear, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The selection process was a cruel game, a macabre lottery where the prize was often a slow and agonizing death. Those deemed worthy of Mengele's attention were spared the immediate horrors of the gas chambers, but were condemned to a different kind of hell, one where they would become nothing more than human guinea pigs. The full extent of Mengele's crimes at Auschwitz may never be fully known. He kept meticulous records of his experiments, but many of these documents were destroyed by the Nazis in the waning days of the war, an attempt to cover up the evidence of their barbarity. However, the testimonies of survivors and the few remaining fragments of evidence paint a horrifying picture of Mengele's depravity. Mengele's experiments were often conducted without anesthesia, the screams of his victims echoing through the halls of his makeshift laboratory. He was obsessed with unlocking the secrets of genetics, believing that he could artificially manipulate human traits to create a master race. Twins were subjected to excruciating pain, their bodies poked, prodded and mutilated in the name of science. He would inject dyes into their eyes, attempting to change their color. He would perform blood transfusions between twins, often with fatal results. Amputations and organ removals were commonplace, all carried out without any regard for the suffering he inflicted. If one twin died, the other was often killed and their bodies dissected side by side, a gruesome comparison study in the name of twisted science. Mengele's experiments were not limited to twins. He was also fascinated by those with dwarfism, subjecting them to humiliating examinations and painful procedures. He collected blood samples, measured limbs, and even extracted bone marrow, all in a futile attempt to prove his warped theories about racial superiority. As the Allied forces closed in on Auschwitz in early 1945, Mengele fled the camp, disappearing into the chaos of wartime Europe. He evaded capture, eventually escaping to South America, where he lived for decades under assumed names. Despite international efforts to track him down, he died in Brazil in 1979, his true identity only confirmed several years later. Mengele's escape from justice left a bitter taste in the mouths of his victims and their families. They had endured unimaginable horrors only to see their tormentor live out his days in relative comfort. The fact that he was never held accountable for his crimes compounded their pain and suffering. The legacy of Mengele's crimes continues to haunt the world. His name is synonymous with medical experimentation and the horrors of the Holocaust. The survivors of his experiments still bear the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal, a constant reminder of the depravity of which humanity is capable. It is our duty to remember the victims of Mengele's experiments and to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. We must learn from the dark chapters of our past and strive to create a world where the dignity of every human being is respected and protected. Only then can we truly say that we have learned the lessons of the Holocaust.